Sorry, I don't have a location for you, Sophie, but they are both producer level patrons, and I'm grateful for your support. The link is in the description to the original content, episode 9, as well as the link all the way back to the beginning if you haven't seen my reaction series. Let's dive right in.
A comet crosses the sky. For 40 days and 40 nights it lingers, growing brighter, longer, then at last fading from view. It's an omen for empire. Its course is the course that all empires take. In Byzantium, sages debate its meaning, but its meaning would soon become all too clear. Hunnish and Bulgar raiders had let loose a storm like never before seen. Their incursions into Scythia Minor and Thrace had grown. City after city was sacked. Twice, Roman generals were defeated in the field, and the horde pushed all the way up to the Anastasian Wall, a bare 40 miles from Constantinople.
See, this is the trouble that Rome eventually is going to have, is that it conquers so much territory, even though we're way past that and we're dealing with a much smaller territory, is that they just don't have the manpower to guard against all the threats that exist on all of these borders in 3 continents. Really, you're dealing with in the east and Asia, you're dealing with Europe in the north and west, and you're dealing with Africa to the south and west. And you just don't have the manpower. Even though Rome's got this great network of roads and they've got all this infrastructure, they just can't keep up, and they can't quickly move troops from one place to another.
Crops were left unattended. Massive portions of the population were enslaved. The economy of the nearby provinces was in ruin. Tax revenue had dropped, and the infrastructure would take years to rebuild. But this was only a temporary threat. Barbarians retreat, raids come and go. And though this one was of the likes not seen in decades, it only served as a prelude to the events that would follow. For the real threat was in the south. A border dispute had flared up and become an open conflict amongst client tribes of the Byzantines and the Persians. These 2 great empires weren't at war, but the ancient world stood on a knife's edge. Justinian had to send somebody to pacify the situation.
So he talks about client tribes, and one of the things you'll see throughout history is that many of these great empires, the Romans, the Persians, the Ottomans later on, some of the Holy Roman Empire will even do this, is a lot of these great empires will have kind of buffer states. Heck, you even really kind of see this in the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War, with how the Soviets have, with the Warsaw Pact, they have these Eastern European kind of buffer states between them and NATO. So you have these buffer states that are kind of your insulation against direct incursions on your own border, because in order to get to your borders, they've got to go through these other states first, and that gives you warning, gives you time.
Belisarius was still in Italy, and with him were many of the empire's best troops. So he sent a man named Cetus, who had been in the region ever since the First Persian War, where Belisarius had won fame at the Battle of Dara. And at first, all went well for Cetus. He tried to win the people to his side, and it worked. A tribe known to the Romans as the Aspetiani secretly sent envoys to Cetus to plead with him to let them remain free if, on the day of the battle when he went to put down the rebellion, they would abandon their rebel border tribes and join his force. Eagerly he accepted, thinking that this would be a route to a bloodless victory. When the Aspetiani switched sides, it would demoralize the other rebels, and when they saw how great a force they now faced, might even persuade them to come to terms. And
of course, these are the same Romans who, well, it's not the same guy, have just made an agreement that they immediately went back on. So what's to keep other people from doing the same thing?
so he had his promise inscribed on tablets of clay and sent by messenger to the Aspetiani. Then he readied his army for the battle. But on the way to confront the rebel forces, some of his outriders encountered a small group of Aspetiani and slew nearly all, either not knowing of the bargain that had been made or not understanding just who this group of rebels was. But some of these men escaped and made it back.
Communication is key, folks. It's always important to make sure you communicate clearly and effectively to the people under your authority.
Back to their tribe.
This is bad.
Shortly thereafter, Cetus cornered the rebels and prepared to fight them in the blasted Armenian hills. But the messengers he'd sent had taken other roads, and his army had outpaced them. So no tablets offering peace, and no promises of safe passage ever reached the Aspetiani. Only news of the death of their comrades and their kin. And so the Aspetiani stayed with the rebels, their resolve to fight now insurmountable on account of the betrayal they thought had occurred. The battle was fierce, and it was personal. The rough terrain didn't allow for the elegant movement of armies, but instead split the fight into 1,000 small actions settled by bravery and skill at arms. And in this chaos, Cetus was isolated, and in his isolation he was recognized by the Armenians and struck down. And so Justinian next sent a man named Bozes to deal with the rebel Armenians. And
I'm starting to get a feeling that this is going to be a situation he's going to keep pouring things into.
Bozes invited them to treat with him, asking that they send their powerful men to speak about terms.
They tried that once.
The Armenians were distrustful of the Romans, but there was one among them, a man named John, who knew Bozes and trusted him, and so convinced the rebels that they should ride out and treat with him. But when they arrived, John's son-in-law saw that their meeting point was surrounded by the Roman army, and so begged John to leave. The rest of the group heard John's son-in-law and left. Only John remained. But for reasons that are still not clear, Bozes slew John, and when this became known, John's son-in-law went to Khosrow, the energetic and able king of
At this point, you have no chance of negotiating with any of these tribes anymore. I mean, this is 0 for 2 on, we're negotiating, but oops, we killed a bunch of you instead. This is terrible.
Persians, and pleaded that he join the war. And in truth, the war may have already had his hand in it, as ever since Vitiges told him of Belisarius being tied up in the west, he had wanted a reason to attack the Byzantines. And now he had it. The great king marshaled his forces and drove into Byzantine territory. But rather than savage conquest, he had a better plan. After all, sieges were such a terrible waste of men and material. Instead, he would drive his massive force up to a town, pop in with his envoys, and let them know that for the low price of a huge amount of gold, he wouldn't burn anything or loot anybody or kill anyone.
Who's going to say no?
And for the most part, the towns agreed to this deal, which seemed like a far better bargain than being sacked after attempting a defense they couldn't possibly sustain.
You're going to lose it all anyway. Better to be basically bankrupted, so to speak, but escape with your lives, and hopefully maybe you can recover afterwards.
And this method of bargaining freed Khosrow to move north like lightning, collecting from town after town on the way until he reached Antioch. Here, the city decided to resist. Khosrow's force rapidly...
So if we're talking about, I mean, if you want to imagine this on a map now, you're talking about Antioch being in Syria, so this is kind of west of the Persians, and then southeast of Constantinople.
Overwhelmed the defenses, but cleverly he left one gate to the city open and unguarded. Seeing a chance for escape, the entire Byzantine garrison took off through the exit Khosrow had left them as soon as things started to go south.
All I can imagine in my mind is these guys panicking, and they're like, what are we going to do? And then looking over and seeing like neon lights saying, exit here, exit here. Don't ever do that, right? It's like the big bright light that the bugs fly into. Don't go there.
And here, Khosrow showed he wasn't playing around. He captured all the citizens, stole all the wealth, and then leveled the place to the ground.
Wow.
At this point, Justinian decided it was time to treat with Khosrow, who asked for thousands of pounds of gold and an annual tribute to go away. But Khosrow wasn't done. Until messengers came back with his gold, he was going to continue his Raid the Byzantines party.
I'm going to stop for just a second here. So I thought it'd be helpful just to visualize this a little bit. So here's the Byzantine Empire. The pink, I believe, is the area that Justinian is going to control at the time that he comes to power. And then, of course, the orange is going to be the area that they're going to conquer in the west, kind of retaking Italy and some of that area. You can see some of the Franks over here. That's eventually going to be, when you add Germany to it, you're really kind of looking at what is Charlemagne's empire at that point. Burgundians are here. You got the Visigoths in a good bit of the Iberian Peninsula. Here's the what we're calling the Persians over here, and you can kind of see how Antioch is in the middle of that, in modern-day Syria right there. But most of Egypt is under the Byzantines at this point. The Vandals are here with Carthage and the islands there. So just it helps to visualize what we're talking about. And so right now what we're talking about is fighting that's going on over here on this border between the Persians and the Byzantine Empire.
First on his to-do list was to take a lovely swim in the Mediterranean to show just how far the Persian Empire had come, just like the Persian heroes of legend. When he was done with his brief dip, he commenced part 2 of Operation Stick It to Justinian. In the next town he came to, he actually paid for a chariot race in the Hippodrome, but stipulated that the Green Rider had to win. Because, after all, as we all know, Justinian was a super fan of the blues.
So this really kind of troll master level, yeah, but it shows that he understands his opponent, right? He knows the politics. He knows the inner workings. Obviously, he's probably had informants and spies and people from the Byzantine Empire that are probably working for him.
After this masterclass in trollsmanship, messengers finally arrived from Justinian, agreeing to the terms. But Khosrow decided, why let a little agreement get in the way of a good extortion campaign, and proceeded to do the same thing he'd been doing basically all the way back home. Although, in part 3 of his Stick It to Justinian master plan, when the citizens of Kari came out to offer him money to go away, Khosrow was like, hey, don't sweat it, bros, you're pagans, we're cool, and sent them their money back. Finally, he thought he'd take a shot at capturing Dara along the way, but in the end was repulsed, and settled for, as usual, a bit of cash to keep moving. Oh, and you remember all of those captives that he took at Antioch? Well, he was never able to sell them back to the Romans, so instead of selling them into slavery, like basically any other ancient ruler would have done, he had a different plan. You see, before razing Antioch to the ground, he'd had his engineers take copious notes on how the city was laid out. And when they got back to Persia, he had them create a new city for the Antiochians, exactly like the old one. And he named it We Antioch Khusrau, or literally, Khosrow's better version of Antioch.
Antioch 2.0. And this is a hearts and minds campaign, right? Look, I'm employing you people and I'm helping you rebuild your city. I want to show you that there's no hard feelings about what has to happen in war.
But as hilarious as all of this was from the Persian side of things, for the Romans, this exposed many of the weaknesses underlying their mighty empire. Weaknesses which caused their allies to begin to doubt. Soon, Lazica, the province just south of the Caucasus Mountains, tried to switch to the Persian side, and war was on again. But, finally, Belisarius was back. He organized a raid into Persia, and although not a resounding success quite like many of his other endeavors, it was successful enough to force the Persians to withdraw from Lazica for the season. The following year, though, the great king returned. This time, Khosrow was aiming at Jerusalem. He arrayed before him a mighty host, far greater than that he'd rode with before. And
this is interesting because this is before the Crusades. This is before Islam. Right? Islam's coming soon and is going to kind of take things by storm in that region. But for now, this is not a religious war in the sense of what we understand it for the next 1,000 years after this.
Began to harry the borders of Palestine. Though Belisarius had done the impossible time and time again, this was probably the end. When he had defied the odds, he'd always found an advantage that he could magnify. Strong walls, more disciplined troops. But now he faced an empire with soldiers hardened by war, well-disciplined, well-equipped, led by energetic and capable men. He faced a force beyond any he could muster. And yet, he resolved to fight, though it would be his life. And so he gathered men to him, all he could rally. This would be a fight like no other, and if he were to die, it would be in service to the empire. If he were to die, it would be with glory. And each day the Persians drew nearer. Each day the horde of the great king moved inexorably closer. Then they stopped, and they withdrew. Some may say that it was because they feared the great name Belisarius, but it was actually because of something much darker. Whispers, a horror on the periphery, a killer of men.
Interesting. What is it? Let's find out. Let's go right into the next episode.
As the great empires battled in the scorched plains of the Middle East, a new threat began to creep its way onto the scene. It was at first a small thing, a local thing. A man in Pelusium dies. But this death served merely as the starting bell, the catalyst for a time of chaos and dread. A darkness reached out from the borders of Egypt and unleashed a horror never before seen on the world. That man in Pelusium had at first felt only a fever, but then a strange fog descended on his mind, accompanied by a swelling of great black pustules on his thigh. Then he began to vomit blood, and his skin began to decay while he still lived. He had the plague. This outbreak in Pelusium is the first recorded instance in world history of the plague. But still, Pelusium was a somewhat isolated place. Sure, rumors began to spread across the empire of a town transformed into a living hell, but
So you have to imagine, for someone living in the 6th century, what this must have felt like, the implications of this, because obviously everyone's going to look at political implications of it and religious implications, and they're going to wonder, is this some kind of sign that we're doing the wrong thing? It's going to cause them to rethink everything they're doing. This is massive.
First, they were only rumors, horror stories to share at night. But then the plague moved up to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, and that horror became very real. The great port city of Alexandria fell into chaos. No medicine or prayer could stop the ravages of the disease.
And it's a port city, so what does that mean? Quickly spreads.
People spoke of the end times, of the wrath of God, and people died. Unfortunately, Alexandria was one of the great ports of the ancient world. It was a center of trade. It provided grain to the greatest cities of Eastern Rome. And so from there, from port to port, the Great Plague made its way across the Roman world. In 542, it reached Constantinople. The horrors it inflicted cannot be overstated. 1 in 4 people in the great city died. Like, imagine that. Imagine if 1 out of every 4 people...
Think about the pandemic we just came through and the numbers of people who died, which is just a minuscule percentage compared to 1 in 4. I mean, that would be, in the United States alone, we're talking, 80, 90 million deaths? Massive.
You knew just vanished. Imagine what it does to an economy, to the functions of trade and of state.
And we see the same thing happen when plague hits in the 14th century in Europe. Just because I know more about what was going on in England than other parts of Europe at that time, just what it did to England, it took a century or more for them to recover in terms of the population, in terms of being able to farm the land and to do all the jobs that needed to be done. Look at Ireland with the potato famine that happened in the middle of the 19th century. Ireland is just now getting back to the population it had nearly 200 years ago.
How does a world run when suddenly, for no rhyme or reason, 1/4 of its people are snatched up by the jaws of death? And those left alive had other grimmer duties. Those struck with the plague didn't die in ways that were uniform. They fell victim to different symptoms, sometimes suffering delirium, sometimes falling into a catatonic state. Some men felt such great thirst that they would run outside, wild, and drink from the fountains until they died, their bodies half in and half out of the water.
Now, this doesn't sound like bubonic plague to me. I'm curious to know if they know exactly what this disease was. Okay, so I'm reading here on something from the Ohio State University site about it, and they are saying it was bubonic plague, and it's the first recorded, at least historical record of bubonic plague. There's records of it in bodies going back thousands of years before that, but they're mostly describing here pretty standard bubonic plague symptoms, though. We're talking about fever, chills, disorientation, swollen, and in some cases oozing buboes, which is where it gets the name bubonic plague. It would be like these things that would appear in your lymph nodes. So interesting to kind of see the descriptions there. So it sounds like the way that Extra History is describing this maybe is kind of exaggerating it a little bit. Which is why I didn't think it sounded like bubonic plague, but it sounds like the descriptions are pretty standard bubonic plague stuff.
Slipped into a coma-like state wouldn't die immediately, not if they had somebody to tend to them. They would eat and drink if nourishment was put to their lips, which meant that many of their loved ones lived with the specter of death, caring for those they love as buboes grew and burst. And those who fell into a coma without somebody to care for them, they starved to death without even knowing. Bodies sealed in houses with no one to discover them until the stench became too great. It was said that no man was seen on the street unless he was carrying a corpse. Justinian had set up an office to handle the burials when the plague first struck, but no functionary, no office of state could keep up with the tide of death. First they filled the cemeteries, then they dug up all the open land in Constantinople to bury the dead. Then, in the state's final days of dwindling functionality, they had dug mass graves outside the walls.
I mean, just imagine, just think of any city in the United States. Go to a city like New York City where, there's 10, 12 million people, right? And suddenly 3 or 4 million of them are dead. Where do you put them all?
But soon these too were filled. Grave diggers tried to press the bodies down and pack them in. As everything unraveled, people just began to dump the bodies into the sea, which only led to bloated corpses washing up along the shore. They also tried filling boats with corpses and pushing those out into the waves. All along the Mediterranean world, ghostly ships, manned only by the dead,
Horrifying.
would find their way to the coastline, bringing a cargo of bodies riddled by the plague. Finally, the people of Constantinople took to simply packing the corpses into the guard towers that lined its great wall. When the wind blew, the stench of decay covered the city. The queen of cities was a ghost town. Those the plague didn't kill, it often drove mad with horror or grief. Suicides increased dramatically.
I was going to say, just the mental health aspect of this alone, combining the fact that everybody has lost people that they love, and the job situation and the economy hit to this, but just the health crisis of the bodies and the mental aspect of seeing that constantly, horrifying stuff.
All over the world, reports spread of grim apparitions, plying the waters in brazen boats, or spreading the plague by a touch of their ghostly hand. Whether they were phantoms of men's plague-addled minds, or merely the specters of fear is unknown, but these
totally understandable that you would have that kind of stuff happen.
Demonic visions gave men even more reason to keep hiding behind locked doors. And with all of this happening, harvest couldn't be collected, crops rotted in the fields, and famine loomed. And the plague spared neither the old nor the young, holy men or scoundrels, rich or poor. Everyone got the plague. Everyone, including Justinian. The emperor fell into a deep coma. Soon, the buboes appeared on his thigh. Every day the city prayed, but everyone knew the plague's course. It was here that Theodora stepped in. Make no mistake, throughout Justinian's reign, she was working behind the scenes. During the course of his rule, she had worked to find space for both Orthodox and Monophysite Christians in the empire.
This is a great point to make. It's a time in history, obviously, when women don't have the same status as men, as they have not for most of history. But that does not mean that women's influence isn't all over history. I think of people like Abigail Adams, who was immensely influential with her husband John, and therefore directly influenced the founding of our nation and the events of the revolution and all of that stuff. Just because a woman doesn't have the title, just because the woman isn't the one in charge, does not mean that women haven't had immense influence throughout history. Theodora is no exception to that.
She had fought for the rights of women, and she had always helped with imperial policy. On top of that, Theodora had also served as a sort of informal spy master for Justinian's regime, uncovering plots and fending off any internal threats to Justinian's power. In fact, she had just recently forced Justinian's ruthless taxman, John the Cappadocian, into exile as a priest as punishment for his willingness to entertain a plot against the emperor. And here, now in this critical juncture, as Justinian lay comatose, Theodora took up the fallen reins of power. And this is a remarkable thing. To think that she could do this, that she could hold all of the jackals and potential usurpers at bay. All around, there were generals with armies at their call. The empire itself was in a state of disarray. Any one of these generals could easily claim that the current regime had been forsaken by God, that the emperor had no clear heir, and by all accounts he was weeks from death at most. At no point since Nika was control of the empire more tenuous. When you consider the fact that Rome, even Eastern Rome, had so often suffered civil wars and rebellions, it's incredible that in the midst of this plague and conflict, armies of Romans didn't array themselves against each other, spilling Roman blood to elevate some other ambitious man to the purple. But Theodora served as a unifying thread, as a continuation of Imperium. She made all the decisions that would normally come to Justinian. She held the court together and acted as a symbol of perseverance for a city and a nation going through unimaginable suffering. But most of all, she acted quickly and ruthlessly, bringing to heel anyone she suspected might attempt to supplant Justinian.
And again, this to us seems like, wow, you just kill people? This is the way things operated at this time. It doesn't make it right. It's just understanding it. And this is what you did. You quickly and ruthlessly deal with threats to your rule, or else more threats crop up. You have to deal with it this way.
She had men of power arrested, she had generals recalled from their armies, and she had her courtiers listen for any sign of sedition. And through doing so, she prevented the civil war that should have come. But one of the men she'd had to recall was Belisarius. The world knew of his promise to never seek the purple while Justinian lived, but Justinian was on his deathbed. Many naturally assumed that Belisarius would simply take on the mantle of emperor once Justinian...
Yeah, this is what you have to do. You've got to keep him where you can see him, right? You can't have him out there with the potential of gathering an army and marching on Constantinople.
Passed. And though he had tried to quiet those rumors, numerous Roman factions had started to campaign for pushing out the existing imperial family and installing Belisarius instead. And thus, Theodora recalled him, tried him, and confiscated the vast wealth he had accumulated during his campaigns. She would later use her friendship with Belisarius' wife as an excuse to restore him to favor, but for now he was stuck cooling his heels in Constantinople, and safely...
Again, this isn't a permanent thing, right? 'Cause, as he's already alluded to, but this keeps the power down. But there's a risk here, too, because you could alienate him, and a guy that's been loyal and has promised to stay loyal, while trying to reduce his power and keeping him from getting too strong, you might push him into the other camp. So this is a calculated risk.
Removed from the power struggle, but also from the battlefield. Luckily for the Byzantines, this plague had struck the Persians as well. The war was by no means over, but there was a lull as each of the great empires struggled with their own internal problems and tried to keep their expensively trained troops away from the plague rather than fighting in the field. And so, for weeks, Constantinople existed in torpor, stunned and reeling from the catastrophe that had befallen it. But then, the impossible happened. Justinian woke up.
And that is going to solidify his hold on power, right? Look at the emperor. He is blessed by God. He was able to overcome when everyone else died from this. That sends a powerful message. So I want to give a quick shout out to Philippe and to Nick8674. Thank you guys so much for your continued support on Patreon. Tomorrow we come back with the last 2 episodes. Thanks for watching.